Hello, everyone. This week we will be discussing Chapter 7, The Relationship. Just to give you an overview of this chapter, we will begin in the cybernetic tradition, talking about the relational patterns of interaction. Then we will move on to the socio-psychological tradition, discussing the theories of relational schemas in the family and social penetration theory. Under the rhetorical tradition, we will be talking about Bakhtin's theory of dialogics and Amy Carrillo-Rowe's theory of coalition and alliance building. In the socio-cultural tradition, we will discuss the theories of identity management, relational dialectics, and communication privacy management. Finally, we will talk about the phenomenological tradition and the works of Carl Roger and Martin Buber. The first theory we will discuss is relational patterns of interaction, and this theory falls under the cybernetics tradition. It is based on the work of Gregory Bateson, Paul Watzlawick, and their colleagues. This theory suggests that when two people communicate with each other, in addition to whatever else they are doing, they are defining their relationships in the ways in which they interact. This theory suggests that patterns get established in relationships, and two kinds of patterns were important to the Palo Alto group, which was the group that these scholars were involved in. They suggest that there are symmetrical relationships, and this is when two people respond to one another the same way. Examples of these types of relationships would be power struggles, when both parties are acting passive, both are questioning, or both are nurturing. The other pattern is complementary relationships, and this is when communicators respond in opposing ways. So examples of this would be when one person is domineering and the other is submissive, or one is argumentative and the other is quiet, or one is nurturing and the other is accepting the nurturing. An idea under the theory of relational patterns of interactions is relational control, and this was investigated by L. Edna Rogers and her colleagues. They suggest that the control within a relationship does not depend on one person's actions. Instead, you have to look at the patterns of behavior over time. So, for example, when one person makes an assertion, the other person can either make a one-down move, which is to accept the assertion, a one-up move, or reject the assertion, or make a one-across move, meaning they neither accept nor reject the assertion. And these ideas can form patterns just like we talked about on the last slide. You can have a complementary exchange, meaning one person makes a one-up move and the other person makes a one-down move, meaning that one person is more dominant. Or you can have symmetrical exchanges where one person one-ups, the other person one-ups, and that would be a power struggle. Or both people one down, so they both reject the assertion, or both people do a one across move, meaning neither one of them accepts or rejects the assertion. Now let's move on to the socio-psychological tradition. The first theory we will discuss in this tradition is relational schemas in the family. And this theory is based on the work of Mary Fitzpatrick and her colleagues. Relational schemas consist of your knowledge about yourself, others, and relationships, along with knowledge about how to interact in relationships. Relational schemas are organized from general to specific. So it begins with what you know about relationships in general, what you know about family relationships as a type, and what you know about your relationships with other members of your family. So the Littlejohn and Foss text gives the example of your brother. So when you're growing up with your brother, you have an understanding of your relationship with him specifically. But then if he goes off to college and comes back and has changed some, and maybe you're not sure how to interact with him, then you would start out by acting towards him the way you've seen other people act towards their siblings in a more distant relationship. And then if he gets married and moves far away and you have very little relationship with him, when you get together the next time, you may just act towards him the way you would act towards anyone else with courtesy and politeness until you reestablish the relationship. So this theory suggests that family communication is not random, but highly patterned, and we'll talk about the patterns that evolve on the next slide. The patterns or schemas posed by this theory have to do with orientations to communication. First is the conversational orientation, and this says that families that have a high conversational schema like to talk, whereas families that have a low conversation schema do not spend much time talking. And then there's the conformity orientation, where families with a high conformity schema go along with family authorities such as parents, and families with a low conformity schema expect more individuality and autonomy. And these two orientations form 4 different types of family schemas. First is the consensual type, where families are high in conversation and in conformity. And in this family type, marriages tend to be traditional in orientation and value stability, role relations, and are strong in interdependence and compassion. The second type is pluralistic, and these families are high in conversation but low in conformity. So in these families, everyone participates in family decision making. The marriage orientation tends to be independent, and the family values autonomy. The third family schema type is protective, and in these families, there is a low conversation orientation and a high conformity orientation. And in these families, a lot of obedience is expected. There is little communication, and marital types are usually separate or not very interdependent. And these families also tend to avoid conflict. The final family type is the laissez-faire. And in this type, families are low in conversation and in conformity. These families are very hands-off, low involvement, and the marriage type tends to be separate or independent. Moving on to the next theory in the socio-psychological tradition, we have the social penetration theory. This theory was spurred by the work of Erwin Altman and Dalmas Taylor. In this theory, social penetration refers to the process of increasing disclosure and intimacy within relationships. The Littlejohn and Foss text gives the example of a sphere. So the outside of the sphere are things that others can see, for example, your clothing or your public persona. And as you move towards the center of the sphere, you have more of the private aspects of yourself. And so as you get to know people, then you allow them access to the more inner layers of your sphere. When you apply social exchange theory to social penetration, it suggests that you will reveal information about yourself when the cost-rewards ratio is acceptable to you. Altman and Taylor suggest 4 stages of relational development. First is the orientation stage, which is when you disclose only public information. Next is exploratory affective exchange, and this is a deeper level of disclosure. The third stage is affective exchange, which centers on evaluative and critical feelings. And finally, the stable exchange, which is the most highly intimate stage. So this theory was important in focusing attention on the relationship as a communication process. However, social penetration as a linear process did not hold up to actual experiences in relationship. So the current theory has transformed to suggest that social penetration is a cyclical dialectic process. Cyclical meaning back and forth cycles, and dialectical meaning never-ending tension between the public and the private. The first theory we encounter in the rhetorical tradition is Bakhtin's theory of dialogics. This theory suggests that there are 2 kinds of forces that impact what Bakhtin calls the prosaic or everyday world. The first is centrifugal forces, which seek to impose order, and the second is centrifugal forces, which disrupt order. And examples of this would be social life, language, or identity, and how these things change over time. 2 concepts that are important in this theory are unfinalizability, which is the belief that nothing is decided yet, and heteroglossia, which refers to the many voices that contribute to the constant change and flux of the world. In Bakhtin's dialogue, he suggests that each participant in the dialogue is open to the possibilities that may be suggested by the other. Each is enriched by the dialogue, and each is a co-creator of the future that is being created in the interaction, a future that is constantly changing as the interaction changes. The next theory in the rhetorical tradition is Amy Carrillo-Rowe's theory of coalition and alliance building. In this theory, Rowe uses the metaphor of power lines to describe how feminists form alliances, quote, through which people are joined and power is transmitted, end quote. She suggests that the sense of belonging and alliance building are intertwined. And Rowe hopes with this theory that as feminists evaluate their alliances and how power is created and used in these alliances, that transracial feminist alliances will be formed. We will now move on to the sociocultural tradition and discuss three relationship theories. The first is identity management theory, and this theory was developed by Tadasu Todd Imahori and William R. Kuppuck. This theory shows how identities are established, maintained, and changed within relationships. This theory is specifically concerned with intercultural relationships and proposed the following ideas. First is identity freezing, and this is the idea of simplifying or stereotyping a partner of a different culture. Non-support when cultural values are ignored. Self-other face dialectics, which is the tension between supporting one's own identity and that of another, and positive-negative face dialectics, which are the tensions between wanting to affirm a cultural value but not wanting to stereotype. Imahori and Kuppuck suggest three relational stages in identity management theory. The first is trial, when partners explore their cultural differences and what cultural identities they want for the relationship. The second is enmeshment, and this is when the couple establishes certain cultural identities and they come to share rules, symbols, and develop common understandings. So an example of this would be a Jewish and a Christian couple that decide to celebrate both Hanukkah and Christmas. Finally, the renegotiation stage, and this is when the couple has a strong relational identity and can now deal constructively with cultural differences as they come up. The next theory in the sociocultural tradition is the relational dialectics theory. This theory was explored by Leslie Baxter and her colleagues. This theory says that relationships are a place where contradictions are managed. And Baxter suggests four vantage points. First, that relationships are made in dialogue. Second, dialogue affords an opportunity to achieve unity in diversity. Third, dialogue is aesthetic, meaning that communicators in a relationship can create this feeling of unity. And fourth, dialogue is discourse, meaning that relationships are an ongoing back and forth process over time. In this theory of relational dialectics, Baxter sees opposing forces in relationships as a cluster of forces or a knot of contradictions. And a couple she suggests are integration and separation, expression and non-expression, and stability and change. For those of you that know Dr. Simmons on campus, he has a really interesting paper using these ideas to describe the experience of African American students attending predominantly white universities. And I've included that on my reference page if you want to check that out. Finally, in this theory, there are 5 qualities that change as relationships develop. The first is amplitude, so that's the strength of feelings and behaviors. The second is salience, which is the focus on either the past, present, or future. Scale, or how long the patterns last. For example, if you have a habit in your relationship of going for long walks after work, maybe you will do that for a month, or maybe you'll do that for several years. Sequence, this is the order of events in relationships. And then pace and rhythm, or the rapidity of events. So in certain times in relationships, there may be a lot of changes or events happening, and other times the pace may be slower. The final theory in the sociocultural tradition is communication privacy management. According to Sandra Petronio, individuals involved in relationships are constantly managing boundaries between public and private, between those feelings and thoughts they are willing to share and those they are not. In contrast to the social penetration theory, which we discussed earlier, CPM suggests that disclosure is not simply an individual decision, but is a consensus based on shared costs and rewards of those in relationships. So an example suggested in the Littlejohn and Fox text is a couple deciding when and how to share the news of a pregnancy. Boundary management, according to Petronio, is a rules-based process. And these rules include boundary permeability, or how open or closed the boundary is supposed to be, boundary linkage, or who is included in the boundary. So for example, a couple might include their immediate family in who they share information with, but they might decide not to share the information with their friends in their social circle. Then there's boundary ownership, so who has the right to disclose the information. And finally, a final idea in this theory is boundary turbulence. And so this is when the boundary rules are ambiguous or violated. The final tradition we'll be discussing in this chapter is the phenomenological tradition. And in this, we will be discussing two scholars. First, Carl Rogers, who was a 20th century psychologist in the field of human relations. His approach was often called the self theory. According to Rogers, the self cannot be separated from relationships. A couple of important concepts in this theory are actualizing tendency, which is seeking autonomy and growth as the self develops. Congruence, which is the consistency between who you are, what you do, and how you fit in the world. Incongruence, which is the loss of this consistency in your life. And Rogers suggests that relationships characterized by negative critical communication tend to breed incongruence, whereas congruence is a product of affirming supportive relationships characterized by unconditional positive regard. Carl Rogers was embraced by communication scholars in the 1960s and the 1970s, but fell out of favor for several years. However, recently, Cisna, Anderson, and Arnett have reinterpreted Rogers' work as a foundation for understanding dialogue, describing it as an interplay between two partners, such that when one partner is able to listen more sensitively to the other, to respond with greater caring and respect, or to be more careful in identifying and expressing his or her own feelings and needs, both parties and the relationship benefit. The final scholar in the phenomenological tradition is Martin Buber. Buber was a 20th century religious philosopher, and he suggested that there were two ways of interacting with people in relationships, either in an I-thou relationship or an I-it relationship. In an I-thou relationship, you see yourself and others as whole persons whose life experiences warrant positive regard, even when the experiences of others differ from your own. Buber suggests that in an I-thou dialogue, we walk on what he calls the narrow ridge between clearly expressing our own ideas and listening to and honoring the ideas of others. He suggests that we often, though, fall into a trap of the I-it relationship, and that's when you think of the other person as an object to be labeled, manipulated, and changed for our own benefit. A few concepts under this idea are the monologue, where we monopolize the conversation or privilege our own ideas. The technical dialogue, which is when you talk about information rather than experiences, or disguised monologue, which is talking around the issues. I was introduced to Buber several years ago when I was studying peace building and conflict resolution, and his ideas have been used to form a seminar with the Arbinger Institute that teach these concepts in relationships and to businesses. And there's a book called The Anatomy of Peace, which explains the seminar in story format. If you're interested in learning more about that, I've included it in my reference page. This concludes my presentation. For the discussion prompt this week, I would like you to choose a relationship theory from Chapter 7 and evaluate it using several of the criteria offered by Littlejohn and Foss that you'll find in Chapter 2, which is on page 34 through 36 of the 10th edition. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to reading your discussions online this week.